Hi, everyone.
Hello again. In the previous pages, the Proclaimer's book has made the case that Abel, Enoch, and Noah were Jehovah's Witnesses. And we made the counterclaim at the end of the previous video that you could demonstrate quite easily that those three names are, you could call them Jehovah's Witnesses. They're faithful men. I think Christians would agree with that. Mm-hmm. But you couldn't make the claim about Noah's family. You know nothing about Noah's family, yet you know they're on the ark safe. Mm-hmm. So what they can get away with those names in claiming that you're a Jehovah's Witness because you're an integrity keeper, someone whose life course is the doing of Jehovah's will. You're going to find it much harder to make that claim about the next 400 years, because now we're down to Abraham. Until you have 400 years from Abraham to Moses, where looking at it closely, you realize that there's no way you're going to be able to make the claim that these people are saved, because they are essentially people who are faithful to God, and He recognizes they're faithful and blesses them. Mm-hmm. So you have here 5 paragraphs leading from Abraham to Moses, and some things are glossed over. See if you can notice what's missing from these paragraphs that we're about to read. Mm. Here's the link from Noah. Following Noah's day, Jehovah had witnesses among the post-flood patriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph are mentioned as an early part of the cloud of pre-Christian witnesses. They demonstrated their support of Jehovah's sovereignty, doing so by keeping integrity. They thus contributed to the sanctification of Jehovah's name. Rather than seek security in some earthly kingdom, they publicly declared that they were strangers and temporary residents in the land, in faith, awaiting the city having real foundations, the builder and maker of which city is God, according to Hebrews 11. They accepted Jehovah as their ruler, anchoring their hope in the promised heavenly kingdom as an expression of His rightful sovereignty.
In the 16th century BCE, Abram's descendants were slaves, needing deliverance from Egyptian bondage. It was then that Moses and his brother Aaron became key figures in a battle of the gods. They appear before Pharaoh and deliver Jehovah's ultimatum: "Send my people away." But proud Pharaoh hardens his heart. He did not want to lose a great nation of slave workers. "Who is Jehovah?" he replied, "so that I should obey His voice to send Israel away? I do not know Jehovah at all, and, what is more, I am not going to send Israel away." That was Exodus 5, 1 and 2. By that disdainful response, Pharaoh, who was believed to be a living God himself, refused to recognize Jehovah's godship.
The issue of godship having been raised, Jehovah now proceeded to prove that He is the true God. Pharaoh, through his magic-practicing priests, summoned the combined power of the gods of Egypt in defiance of Jehovah's power. But Jehovah sent 10 plagues, each announced by Moses and Aaron, to demonstrate His dominion over earth's elements and creatures, as well as His supremacy over Egypt's gods. Following the 10th plague, Jehovah brought Israel out of Egypt by a strong hand.
It took much courage and faith for Moses, the meekest of all men, to appear before Pharaoh, not once but many times. Moses, however, never watered down the message that Jehovah commanded him to deliver to Pharaoh. Not even the threat of death could silence his testimony. Moses was a witness in the true sense of the word. He testified repeatedly and forcefully to the godship of Jehovah. Following that deliverance from Egypt in 1513 BCE, Moses wrote the book of Genesis. Thus began a new era, the era of Bible writing. Since Moses evidently wrote the book of Job, he had some discernment of the issue between God and Satan. But as Bible writing progressed, the issues involving God's sovereignty and man's integrity would be put clearly on the record. Thus all concerned could gain full knowledge of the great issues involved. Meanwhile, in 1513 BCE, Jehovah laid the groundwork for producing a nation of witnesses.
Well, before we get to the issue of what's missing in these paragraphs, because I have to say up front that I would agree with most of what they say here as a summary of the 400 years and certainly Moses' role. We'll get back to what we have to disagree with in the first paragraph, though. But here's two assertions. One, Moses evidently wrote the book of Job. No evidence is presented for that. What they're doing here is following a Jewish tradition. There's no evidence within the book that Moses wrote it. So, again, an assertion which becomes a truth that Jehovah's Witnesses just parrot because it's in the literature, right? And then there's the date. This date is just as problematic as the date 607, but without the consequences for credibility. Nobody I've ever checked, and I've checked quite a few, thinks that the Exodus occurred in the year 1513 BCE. As we said about their public pronouncements about the date of the flood or the date of creation, it's all built upon suppositions which can't be supported. Some can be supported better than others. This one can't be supported at all. So the fact that they assert it, though, it becomes a truth that is then just assumed to be true if you're a witness, right? Well, in that first paragraph, they cite Hebrews 11. And here's the verses that are relevant since they've named four names here. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph are mentioned in an early part of the book of this is the book Hebrews 11. It says they're mentioned in an early part of the cloud of pre-Christian witnesses. They demonstrated their support of Jehovah's sovereignty, doing so by keeping integrity. So here's the relevant passage. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named." He considered that God was able to even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. So what you probably would miss if you were reading this devotionally is that the faith is in all four cases at the end of their lives. There's nothing here about their morality or their faithfulness. And there's certainly nothing here about them proving to be witnesses by their integrity keeping.
The emphasis seems to be that they had faith in God and in God's promises. So they act on that faith of God's promises, believing it.
Yeah. And in the case of Abraham, he's near the end of his life when he offers up his son, who's already at least a teenager. And the other three are explicitly at the end of their lives, right? Isaac on his deathbed, and we know Isaac had messed up just like his dad in hiding the truth from a king, just like his dad.
So it's God's integrity that's consistent, and he's the integrity keeper, not the people. Because Abraham's life, we know, we've studied, that he fails tests and he passes tests.
Well, of course, again, the odd man out here is Jacob. He's the one we, as witnesses, have to ignore because he's plainly not, most of the time, an integrity keeper. But on his deathbed, he's come to his senses. He's 147 years old, but he's come to his senses and now realizes that God has been guiding him all his life. And even Joseph, who was an integrity keeper, if there ever was one in the Old Testament, yet Joseph's morality and his truthfulness and his avoiding evil are not stressed here. What is stressed is that at the end of his life, he looked forward and obviously believed in the promises of God about the promised land, and therefore directed that his bones too, along with Jacob's, be taken to that promised land. So what we would miss that, and what we've got instead is that they demonstrated their support of Jehovah's sovereignty by keeping integrity.
Yeah. Then when you get to the whole situation of Moses and Israel, what's missing is any comment about the character of the Israelites.
Yeah.
You know, what were they doing during the Exodus, and how were they talking in the wilderness?
Well, even before that, what was their life like in...
Yeah.
Were they keeping their integrity for 400 years?
Yeah. He doesn't act because they've been good. It says that they were worshiping the Egyptians' gods, right?
You wanted to read Ezekiel 20. Yeah, this is a good summary of what their religious life was like when they were in Egypt.
Verses 5 to 9 of chapter 20. This is what the sovereign Lord says. On the day I chose Israel, I swore with uplifted hands to the descendants of the house of Jacob, and revealed myself to them in Egypt. With uplifted hands I said to them, I am the Lord your God. On that day I swore to them that I would bring them out of Egypt into a land I had searched out for them, a land flowing with milk and honey, the most beautiful of all lands. And I said to them, each of you get rid of the vile images you had set your eyes on, and do not defile yourselves with idols of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. But they rebelled against me and would not listen to me. They did not get rid of the vile images they had set their eyes on, nor did they forsake the idols of Egypt. So I said I would pour out my wrath on them and spend my anger against them in Egypt. But for the sake of my name I did what would keep it from being profaned in the eyes of the nations they lived among, and in whose sight I had revealed myself to the Israelites by bringing them out of Egypt.
We made the point in one of our Genesis videos that Joshua, at the end of his life, makes the point that they haven't yet completely thrown away the idols of their Babylonian past at that point in time, and that's after this.
Yeah.
And obviously here, Ezekiel's making the point, they didn't cast off the gods of Egypt when they were there, and even after they left.
Yeah.
And they were worshiping new gods in the wilderness, Amos says. And then we know they struggle for 800 years after they get in the promised land with idolatry.
Yeah. So they're not picked because they're integrity keepers. They're not saved because they're integrity keepers. It's God that has the integrity.
And yet, this does affect the future too, because the most common complaint you hear about Israel's restoration is, well, they don't deserve anything. They killed Messiah. They've disobeyed God. You hear that all the time, and that, yet you know, if you think about it, what we just read, namely that they weren't.
Yeah.
They weren't integrity keepers in Egypt, and they remained unfaithful for 800 years after.
Even as witnesses, we always, the term that always came to my mind was stiff-necked.
Yes.
Well, yeah, that is true. So how does this last statement that I read from here, Jehovah laid the groundwork for producing a nation of witnesses, work in the case of this? You're ignoring, if you read the Torah, integrity is not the word you're going to come up with, not for the people. So they were idolaters, they were ungrateful, and they were rebellious. That's what you read over and over again in the Torah.
They were ungrateful, and they remained ungrateful, and they're still ungrateful, but nevertheless they're God's people. When he says to Pharaoh, say this, he says to Moses and Aaron, let my people go. They're his people not because they're integrity keepers, but because he's made a covenant relationship with them through Abraham.
He's made promises. He's the integrity keeper.
So there's the answer to, well, how can Israel in the Middle East be God's people today? Well, they're God's people in the ethnic sense. They are part of Abraham's seed, and therefore he has made promises to them. So that's the answer. Ezekiel 36, he says the same thing he says here, namely that it's not for your sakes I'm doing this.
It's his reputation, it's his name, and it's his promises.
Which he says you, Israel, have profaned among the nations. That's 800 years after Moses. He says, you have profaned my name, but it's for my name's sake I'm going to keep my promises to you.
Yeah.
So a nation of witnesses indeed, but not because they're faithful. Next time we get to a nation of witnesses is the next subhead.
We're linking to a video of Ray Franz on Isaiah 43.
Yeah.
Faithful and discreet slave, self-praise in Isaiah 43. So, but if you read Isaiah 43, the Jehovah's Witnesses there are not the faithful ones. It's they're witnessing His faithfulness, God's faithfulness.
Exactly. See you next time.